Our next presenter is Mary Holland. She's a research scholar at New York University School of Law. Ms. Holland, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I want to start by asking a couple simple questions to be answered by a show of hands. How many of you have ever, for any reason, been critical of the United Nations? Security Council, peacekeepers, budget issues come to mind. I see a lot of hands. Okay. And how many of you have ever been critical of the United States for any reason? Foreign policy, domestic policy, role in the primary elections, right? So we're here at the UN, we're in the United States, but the vast majority of us have been critical of these institutions at one time or another. To me, this is like asking, are you alive? Are you breathing? Are you a thinking person? It is human and normal to be critical. Almost all of us have been critical at some point because these are complex institutions with varying actions and inactions all the time. But now, if I ask you, have you ever been critical of your country's vaccine policies? You may be reluctant to raise your hand, and for good reason, because in the supercharged public discourse about vaccines, were you to answer, yes, I have been critical of some aspect of vaccine policy at some time, you would likely be branded anti-vaccine, that fundamentalist boogeyman term, and not by a militant or fringe publication or spokesperson. You might be branded anti-vaccine by the likes of the New York Times, the New England Journal of Medicine, the World Health Organization, and by spokespeople from National Centers for Disease Control and National Pediatric Associations. Your views on vaccines might be considered outside the mainstream and equivalent to the views of those who deny climate change. You might be considered, as I have sometimes been, a flat earther. No matter if your critiques were categorical or that you truly oppose all vaccines for all people at all times, or if you simply believe, as many people here and I do, that mercury should never be a preservative in any vaccine anywhere in the world because there are better and safer alternatives. Many in this, thank you. Many in this audience here today are branded anti-vaccine, although that is a gross distortion. We are called this primarily to marginalize and dismiss our views. But just as most of you are critical of some aspects of the UN and of the US, but think that they are important institutions, most of us have views that are nuanced, pro-health, and pro-safe, affordable, necessary, and effective vaccines, or sane vaccines. So my focus today is on the role of law in protecting human rights when it comes to vaccines. How can we balance the rights of the collective versus the rights of the individual? Vaccines, by their very nature, are a population-based medical intervention. If enough people take this medical intervention, then the so-called herd will be protected from the circulation of a communicable disease based on the theory of herd immunity. Although individuals receive vaccines, the rationale for vaccines is for the good of the individual and the society. One of the core purposes of the United Nations, set forth in Article 1 of its charter, is to achieve international cooperation in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms of all. So the UN and the international community have obligations to respect human rights related to vaccination. But how must nations in the UN do this? This is an important question that deserves scrutiny as it profoundly affects both individual and public health. Since World War II, the international community has recognized the grave dangers in involuntary scientific and medical experimentation on human subjects. In the aftermath of Nazi medical atrocities, the world affirmed the Nuremberg Code, which stated that the voluntary consent of human subjects is absolutely essential. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights further enshrined this prohibition against involuntary experimentation, stating, "No one shall be subjected without his free consent to medical or scientific experimentation." Such a prohibition is now universally recognized so that some courts and scholars have pronounced the right to informed consent as a matter of customary international law. In other words, it applies everywhere, whether or not a country has it on its books. And it's the same as the norms prohibiting slavery, genocide, torture, and piracy. But what about informed consent in the area of treatment, including preventive treatments like vaccines? This is a controversial issue today in many countries, including the United States. In 2005, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, addressed this issue, adopting the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights based on a consensus of 193 countries, including the United States. The participating countries hoped that this declaration, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights before it, would become a set of guiding principles. On the issue of consent, the declaration states, any preventive medical intervention is only to be carried out with the prior, free, and informed consent of the person concerned based on adequate information. It further notes that the sole interest of science or society is not sufficient. This pronouncement is the extension of the medical oath attributed to Hippocrates 2,500 years ago, that doctors must work for the good of their patients and never do harm. Abbreviated as the first do no harm principle, this credo embodies the precautionary principle in medicine, clearly placing the interests of individual patients above the interests of the collective or so-called herd. This precautionary principle leads directly to the view that vaccination policies must be recommended, not coerced. The doctor-patient relationship depends first and foremost on trust, and coercion undermines it. When the doctor-patient relationship is based on coercion, trust is a casualty, and doctors then serve the state, and by extension the society, above their individual patients. This is a slippery slope where civilized medicine has too often derailed in the past. Dr. Leo Alexander, the chief U.S. medical consultant to the Nuremberg trials, warned in 1949 that from small beginnings, the values of an entire society may be subverted. He pointed out that long before Nazis came to power in Germany, a cultural shift in the medical community had, quote, already paved the way for adoption of a utilitarian, Hegelian point of view, with literature on the euthanasia and extermination of those with disabilities as early as 1931. Following the medical precautionary principle, the default position for vaccination must be recommendations, not compulsion. Individuals, for themselves and their minor children, should have the right to accept or refuse the preventive medical interventions based on adequate information and without coercion, such as the threat of loss of economic or educational benefits. Informed consent must be the default position because compulsion on its face not only undermines trust, but limits the fundamental rights to life, liberty, bodily integrity, informed consent, privacy, and parental decision-making. Many developed countries' vaccination policies embody this principle of childhood vaccination recommendations, including conference co-sponsors Germany and Japan. Other developed countries that achieve impressive public health without resort to compulsion include the United Kingdom, Australia, Austria, Denmark, Iceland, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, South Korea, and Spain, among others. Nonetheless, the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights does permit limitations of fundamental rights, but these limits must be imposed by law and must be, quote, for the protection of public health or the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. Furthermore, any such law needs to be consistent with international human rights law. International courts have developed a test to assess whether restrictions of fundamental rights are legitimate and lawful. The test studies whether a measure is lawful, strictly necessary, and proportionate to the risk. The state enacting the restriction bears the burden of proof that the compulsory medical intervention is lawful, strictly necessary, and proportionate. Generally, strict necessity must be the least restrictive alternative to achieve the public health objective, and non-coercive approaches must be considered first. Thus, the state must show that a less restrictive alternative is not feasible before adopting a highly restrictive or coercive one. In addition to these criteria, if a state does mandate vaccination, then it has an affirmative obligation to provide an effective remedy for those who have been injured as a result. Like all prescription drugs, vaccines carry the risk of injury and death to some. The guarantee of an effective remedy is a basic pillar of the rule of law in a democratic society, and the remedy must actually be an effective one. It can't be an illusory remedy, which in fact provides no relief. Vaccination policies have changed drastically since the early 20th century, when they were primarily emergency medical interventions for whole populations in times of smallpox outbreaks, to the policies of today, when they primarily target infants and young children for non-emergency prevention of many diseases of varying severity. Legislatures and courts have had to grapple with many issues flowing from these policies, including vaccine injury compensation, religious exemptions, philosophical exemptions, the right to education, the right to informed consent, and the right to parental decision-making. I provide a few examples of court decisions related to vaccination from courts in different countries. In Japan, in 1992, the Tokyo High Court heard a case from 159 survivors of vaccine-induced injury or death. The court concluded that the Ministry of Health had been negligent in failing to establish a screening program to exclude people with contraindications to vaccination. The court noted that the Ministry of Health had focused on measures to raise vaccination rates at the expense of attention to vaccine adverse reactions. Furthermore, the court noted that the ministry had not provided sufficient information about vaccine adverse events to doctors and the public. The court concluded that the injured victims were entitled to compensation as a matter of state policy. In Ukraine, in 2004, its constitutional court interpreted the Constitution to guarantee the right of education on the principle of equality, and it found that every child was entitled to a school-based education, regardless of their vaccination status. The Turkish Constitutional Court in 2015 upheld the principle of parental consent and that it was necessary for the vaccination of children and infants. It found that despite the Ministry of Health's assurance that childhood vaccinations are in the best interest of the child, the infant's interest in bodily integrity may only be violated for medical necessity and based on law, and that was not the case for routine vaccinations. On the other hand, in January 2015, a judgment of the Czech Constitutional Court upheld a public health law prohibiting young children from attending preschool, without vaccinations against 9 diseases unless the children had permanent contraindications. But the judgment was over a stinging dissent, arguing that the court's decision was more politically motivated than based on a rigorous constitutional analysis. The dissent found that the majority's decision had turned a blind eye to the unconstitutionality of the law, and that the court's decision would ultimately undermine rather than advance the legitimacy of vaccination mandates. In the United States, the legitimacy of school vaccination mandates came into sharp focus last year when almost 20 states introduced legislation to limit or prohibit altogether exemptions from vaccination except for very limited medical ones. Only in the state of California did blanket legislation pass, which prohibits all exemptions save limited medical ones, although similar laws already exist in 2 other states, Mississippi and West Virginia, to that effect. We are likely to see in the near future whether California courts will uphold or reject this new law, which directly contradicts the California Constitution's guarantee of a right to a public education for all children. We will see whether courts are prepared to endorse a new kind of school segregation against 225,000 children whose vaccination statuses do not conform perfectly to California's dictates. With over 270 vaccines in the global research and development pipeline, the role of law and courts in upholding or rejecting vaccination mandates and in compensating the victims of vaccine injury is critical. As we all understand, healthcare is a big business the world over, and vaccines represent a growing medical market with increasingly high profit margins. If we don't adhere to first principles of the rights to life, liberty, and bodily integrity of the individual, and the right to prior, free, and informed consent in medicine, we may find ourselves with both known and unknown harms. To conclude, I paraphrase President Eisenhower's farewell address to the United States in 1961 when he was addressing the benefits and risks posed by the military-industrial complex. I substitute the term medical-industrial complex, which I believe today poses many of the same benefits and risks. He foretold, the potential of the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this complex endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and medical machinery of health with our methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. In holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite. So let us be alert, knowledgeable, and properly integrate the interests of global health security and global liberty. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Holland. I don't have to say anything. You have a standing ovation, and I have a bunch of questions for you. Our concluding